breaking this down into like, what people would live through in their human lives. I mean, one of the things that I was discovering and working through on the research for this podcast was just the kind of ownership model where not only could individuals buy housing or buy shares in housing in very, very far away places, but also where individuals could become part of the owner of a housing even through not even directly buying the housing themselves, but through bond markets and the financialization of housing ownership, where we can now take housing resources, take homes, take apartment buildings, take bundles of single family homes into property management portfolios, bundle them all into a bond, and then trade the bond on a market. And if we can bundle it into a bond that is traded on the market, we can bundle it into a community trust that is managed by the members of the community themselves, that is managed by the people who live in the houses themselves and who live in the apartments themselves, right? You could have a system of housing where you don't even necessarily have landlords and tenants. One of the conspiracies that floats around the more, mirror world or unhinged parts of the internet right now is the idea that REITs and these kind of like large scales property ownership of real estate is actually, and I kid you not, they believe it is a communist plot because, and the reason why is it takes ownership away from individual people and puts it in the hand of an upper management elite, right? So the idea here being, if the technology is only controlled by a few corporations for the sake of an elite, right? If that technology were managed by the people who lived in the homes themselves.
That's the point.
And the people who lived in the homes themselves were also part of the bond holders who hold those properties, who hold ownership of those properties. We could essentially create a cooperative management system that is geographically dispersed and managed using the same kind of methods, right? The whole reason why corporations can now run these large portfolios of widely dispersed single-family homes where they couldn't before is because you can stick a smart home manager in each of those homes, and then the smart home manager and the resident would interact to file reports for things like repairs, upgrades, and so on, need for new appliances, need for insulation replacement, window repair, things like that. And then there would be a distributed system run by an information management software program that would send repair crews and contractors to all those various locations. And there doesn't need to be a centralized human manager in a centralized physical location organizing it all by face-to-face conversations. And right now, all that is managed by, REITs and by large-scale corporate holders. But if those systems were owned and managed by the residents themselves, then the power would rest with the residents themselves.
That's the technological shift we have to do.
Because we can still use that technology for the sake of the residents. And indeed, there are some cases where financialization can take us beyond the typical ways the financialization is used for. Because one weird thing that is a potential benefit from this is possibly even the end of the renoviction or the end of the property transfer eviction, right? Because one problem when you're dealing with private ownership, right, with individual-sized private ownership, is that an individual ends up having to massively lower the asking price of their home if there's already a tenant in it. I know someone in my own life who had to evict a tenant in the middle of their of this housing crisis because they were going through a divorce and had to sell the house, and the house's value had to be maximized, right? And so if the ownership is distributed in this way, is financialized in a way that is still controlled by residences, because the homeowners would be part of the bondholders, right? And separate from the bond, and the bondholders and the ultimate owners would be separate enough that they have an interest in simply keeping the rental income going. That could be a way in which distant ownership and large-scale communal ownership of housing can actually benefit, because the interest now is in keeping the money flowing through the bond for the sake of the bondholders, for the sake of the ultimate owners of the property. And if the rents need to be stable and the rents need to move through, and you need to prevent the default of those bonds through too many disruptions in rents as tenants change and as ownership and individual properties change, now you can keep a tenant in a property even as you sell it, even as you move it from one bond portfolio to another, right? And that's an opportunity to stabilize housing. That's an opportunity to create more sane and reasonable and long-term stable communities through, paradoxically, according to our intuitions, this kind of financialization. There are ways in which we can take this distributed ownership and manage it for the sake of people and not manage it for the sake of immediate investors.
And use the same model of technology for that.
Yes, exactly. The technologies can be applied to communal ownership and to keeping people safe in their homes rather than making things unstable through things that are out of someone else's control. You know, a change in family status, a change in property status, you know, the owner of a house dying and it being taken over by an heir who, you know, has their own plans. That doesn't necessarily have to change the situation of a tenant. That doesn't necessarily have to change the situation of someone living there if we have this more distributed ownership model, and the distributed ownership model isn't being pumped and dumped for short-term profit, as unfortunately too many real estate holdings in our current, you know, neoliberal economic framework are. And I think that is much more of a vision for a future than we are getting from the current privatized and financialized and neoliberal setup for housing ownership. Leilani, what are some of your thoughts as our special guest on this particular vision? I know I threw a lot out there, but
that's a lot. That's a lot. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind is, you know, what we were talking about before, which is who owns the data and how is it being used. And of course, those who own the data make a huge amount of money by selling that data or, you know, providing that data to corporate landlords, et cetera. And so breaking that is one of the key things. And we've seen what happens, and I don't want to take us too far afield, but we've seen what happens when people use data for people. And I'm thinking, yes, of Julian Assange. And, you know, look at what it's amazing if you think about that, because there is a way in which he was just trying to make data and information available to everyday people so that we would know, so we would have increased transparency basically around a lot of things. And that's not acceptable in our society right now. That's just simply not acceptable. So, I mean, I don't want to take us too far afield down the Assange road, but just to say that this idea that Midierson brought up earlier around data and power is so true, right? Who owns the data and what they do with it. And so, you know, I think it's interesting, Adam, to try to think through ways of breaking through that. And some other ownership models, certainly where data is used for other ownership models, is certainly the way of the future. Funnily enough, I was meeting yesterday with a community land trust here in Ottawa, where I'm situated, you know, and they're trying to do things differently. It's a different ownership structure. You know, it's a not-for-profit ownership structure. I met this morning with a really interesting outfit, financial outfit, developer outfit in Scandinavia, in Denmark, where their tenants, they pay market rents, But the financial model is such that while there are investors in the properties, the tenants are investors as well. Their rent is their investment, and they receive a 15% return on their annually on their investment, and as renters, which lowers their rent basically, right? I mean, they pay the rent, but then they get this bonus through their investment, so it lowers their rent. And this financial actor is rethinking tenant relations, for example. Like, it's a whole other, he described it to me as somewhere between home ownership and renting, because once you give an investor return to a tenant who's paying their rent as their investment, it changes the nature of their relationship to the property. Right. And I just, it was fascinating. And of course, we know that in the employment sector, there are corporations that have done that, where employees, own shares in the company, and it changes the behavior. It changes simple things like whether people arrive to work on time or not, all sorts of things, right? It changes productivity. And so it's an interesting model. I'm not suggesting the Scandi novel that I'm talking about is the be all end all, because it does replicate in some ways existing models, but it's also trying to turn them on its head. So only to say, I'm with you. I have to sit down and really think about what you said in terms of how these bonds would work, et cetera. That's what the Community Land Trust is trying to do, is trying to create what are more like social bonds that would attach to help pay for the acquisition of buildings to turn them into community land trusts. And the investors they'd be going after are different types of investors, individual investors, and as well as individuals of ultra high net worth, but also institutional investors, but who want to have social impact.